I have to say a big sorry that I can't give this paper in French. You have to imagine when I started working for archaeology, this was still a national subject, and so we got this National Institute for Archaeology, and half of my colleagues were French-speaking, and to be honest, we were mostly French-speaking in that institute. And after we split up at the end of the 80s, I completely lost all my fluency, if I ever had it, in your language. So sorry, it will be in English, but it will be simple English. And when there is something that's not clear, please ask me and we'll look for a translation. The question I want to ask you this afternoon is, imagine that you are an artist and you are sitting at your desk and you are writing or drawing comic books like you see here. And you have to depict a scene, like here in this book of Herman, a scene where a lord in his castle is having a dinner and guests are coming over, and you have to draw a lot of detail, and you ask yourself, what were these people eating in this castle, say 12th, 13th century? What were they having for dinner? What would I depict, what would I draw on this dinner table? Fact is that this is a very easy question to ask, hello, but it's really difficult to answer. And the main problem with medieval food is that everybody thinks that they know a lot about medieval food. And in fact, we will see that the story is more complicated than we often think. What we know about medieval food is written by cliches, it's common sense knowledge, and it's often so, it's more like a caricature than real science. And one of the illustrations of that is when you go to the internet and you Google terms like medieval food, you end up with a lot of information. And in fact, you can have medieval dinners almost everywhere nowadays. Here, an example in Bruges, where they organize medieval feasts. And in fact, it gives the impression that medieval food is now more popular than it has ever been during the Middle Ages. Everybody wants to do it, it's fun, and sadly, what you get on these occasions is not medieval at all. The main idea is you have to dress up, like you see here, all sorts of clothing that are, of course, not medieval at all, and you gather, you are sitting here and at a table that is also certainly not medieval in terms of organization, but it's all about large quantities of meat, and it must be really fat. That's the general idea we all have about the medieval cuisine. And you see here, everything is mixed in the same plate, and what you do is you eat a lot, and you drink a lot, and you eat with your hands because that's dirty, and so it gets more and more medieval. But these are all cliches. You have to drink enormous quantities of beer in this case, but mostly people were drinking wine when they were dining in a castle. And you even see here this guy has a styrofoam box where he will take the leftovers as a kind of a doggy bag to take with him at home. So this is what people, knowing it or not, always have in the back of their minds when they are thinking about medieval food. It's about a lot of things to eat, it's fat, it's about meat, but we will see this afternoon that there is more to this story than these cliches. In fact, the whole story started to change in the 60s and 70s when people started to look at medieval cooking books. And one of the most famous researchers in that field is a lady from the Netherlands, Johanna Maria van Winter, who started to edit these books so that they became available to everybody, so that everybody could read how people in the Middle Ages thought about preparing food. And she made a lot of scientific publications, She still does. She's nearly 100 meanwhile, and still active, still teaching. And she also made a kind more popular books like this Van Soetener Kokenen, which is a collection of Roman and medieval recipes. This gave already another view of medieval gastronomy, and going back to the original sources even learned us more about how people were eating in those days. And this is one of the most famous cooking books from the late Middle Ages, Le Livre de Taillevent, who was the chief of the kitchen of the King of France. And this late medieval book gives a lot of recipes showing how things were prepared in the kitchen of the French king. But when you read those texts, you immediately encounter problems when you want to transfer this knowledge to a general idea of how people were eating during the Middle Ages. One of the problems is that all the books that we know, and there aren't a lot, but all the books that we know from the late Middle Ages, they all come from the upper class. So it's only the really rich households who could afford to have such books, who could afford to have a library, and who could read. Poor people couldn't read, so it was useless for them to have a cooking book. And cooking books were expensive things. It was something prestigious to have in your household. And some people even wonder how often people use these books. It's maybe more of a book to have than a book to use. And so it's always the upper class. And when you study the recipes that are in those books, one of the striking things is it's only the best things, the best recipes, even for those very rich and noble people. So what you will find in this book is not everyday food, even not for the higher classes in former society. It's only things that they were eating on special occasions, on Sundays, when they had guests, when they wanted to impress people, and they had to show a really rich table for noble guests. So in fact, we don't get a lot of knowledge of inside information about everyday food, even not for the upper class. Another problem with medieval cooking texts is that it's really hard to cook from them. You must be an expert cook to be able to translate such a medieval recipe into things that we can use in our everyday kitchen. Like this is the whole recipe for a stew of pork, so the meat of the pig. And when you read those texts, what is really striking is you don't have any measures. You don't have any cooking times. They don't say how much you have to use of all the spices and things that are described here. So it's really difficult to cook with it. And you don't know for how many people this recipe was meant. And sometimes these recipes give you the suggestion that it deals with a lot of meat, but we don't know how big the party was. So maybe these things were written for groups of 20, 30 people. And that has also given that idea that people in the Middle Ages were eating enormous quantities of meat, while, to be honest, we are not really sure that this was true. So you don't learn too much about gastronomy from these texts. Another source that you can use are the household records. Household records where people, for instance, in an abbey or a castle, wrote down what they were cooking, what they were buying for the kitchen. And what you see is a really typical example here. For a certain day in the 15th century, somebody has noted some ingredients that were needed for the kitchen and that were bought at the local market. And you could try to reconstruct daily food from that, but it's, again, really, really difficult because now we know that these records are really incomplete. People only wrote down what they needed at a certain day in the year and that things that they needed to buy at the market, but everything that they could produce themselves, like from their own animals or from their own gardens, is not written down there. So this is a really incomplete view of what was needed in a kitchen on a certain day. So all these fragments help us a little bit, but it's not enough. When you go and look to images and you try to do and set up a study of the iconography of the medieval kitchen, then it's as problematic as studying texts, because scenes like this one that are showing what people were eating are extremely rare for the Middle Ages. And you see here from the famous tapestry of Bayeux, you see here people sitting at a table, but you can't recognize what they were eating. So it's really difficult to get a view of ingredients, of recipes from these images. Even in later times, when you go to the Burgundian calendar books, here you see a picture of the Très Richeur du Duc de Berry, then you see a more detailed scene, and you can recognize that these are birds on the table, on this plate, here the same, but all the other ingredients are again very difficult to recognize. So this doesn't help neither. In fact, we have to wait until the 16th century, but then the Middle Ages are already past, to find pictures like this, with the famous pictures of Joachim Beukelaar and all his followers. You see market scenes, sometimes also kitchen scenes, where you can clearly recognize the animals that are painted. And somebody who knows a little bit of fish can easily recognize these species. And this is one of the first realistic depictions of market scenes of food ingredients that we have for our part of the world. And then you would think that this would help, but art historians warn us that the use of these pictures, these paintings, as a reconstruction for former markets is also very dangerous, because they tell us that this whole scene is completely submerged with symbolism. There are all sorts of stories, symbolic meanings hidden between these fishes that are depicted here, and it has to do with sexuality, it has to do with wealth. There is a whole world of meaning behind this painting that we can't even understand completely anymore. But this is not a fish market as it was in the 16th century. For instance, to just mention one thing, we know from archaeology, and I'm going slowly towards archaeology, we know from our excavations and from the many sift samples that we have taken in all different sorts of medieval and later sites, that the most important fish on the medieval market, especially in towns, was herring. And where is the herring here on this picture? Nowhere to be seen. So the most common fish is even not painted here. And these scenes were meant, of course, to be part of the interior of very luxurious houses. And all the food products that you see here, these are all the high-priced fish. So this is not the common species on the market. These are all the ones that costed a lot. And big cod here, morue, the perch here, the pike, all these species are the most expensive ones. And so this is not a real picture of the medieval market. So it's getting complicated. So what we will have to do now is rely on archaeological finds to try to add to this story and to make a more complete picture of medieval food. And I'm not going to do that just with giving examples, because just making lists of identifications from archaeological sites, that doesn't help too much. When you are trying to reconstruct the food, the dietary pattern of a certain group within society, you have to know what its place was in society. And so you can't think about medieval food, as long as I'm concerned, when you don't have a view on the structure of medieval society. And the model I'm going to use for that is not something randomly chosen, because it's the model that medieval people invented for themselves. What we know is that in the 10th century, going towards the year 1000, you see a number of texts appear that say that society is organized in a divine way and is in fact subdivided in 3 classes. And these classes are installed by God, and so this is a model for society that people cannot change. So rebellious behavior against this system has no use, because it is a system made by God. And these 3 classes are depicted here. It's the people, you see here, the bishops and the priests. Those are the ones that pray. These are the kings and princes and other noble people. Those are the ones who fought, who went to war. And these are the common people who did all the work. And this system works together, the texts say, and it works together in a kind of a divine harmony. So you will see mostly these terms, and hey, that's strange. With the conversion from my computer to the Mac, you get these funny symbols. See what's come out next. So 3 classes: the clergy, those who pray, Onroerend in Latin, nobility, and the people, the ones that fight and the ones that work. Here you see the same in translation. And what we see now in our sites, and what I'm going to try to demonstrate for you, is that the food of these 3 classes, because they have a different place within society, was also different. So you can't speak of a general medieval dietary pattern. This pattern was different according to the class you were living in. And so the people who fought had another diet than the people who prayed. And we will start with the people who fight, with kings and princes and lords of the castle. And we go back to a number of sites that we have excavated in Flanders and Wallonia that are rather well known in our archaeology. And these are the Motte and Bailey castles. So the first wooden castles that we see appear in the 11th century and that last until the 12th, 13th century, when they are gradually all replaced by stone castles. A number of archaeologists working in post-World War II archaeology in Flanders have concentrated upon these castles. One of them is John de Meulemeester, who did this for Flanders. In Wallonia, there is famous excavations have been done by André Matthijs, who used to be director of the Wallonian Service for Archaeology. And we know a lot about these castles because these were the days before rescue archaeology. People in the National Service of Archaeology went out to sites that were not disturbed by any later buildings and excavated them to see what was happening there during the Middle Ages. Nowadays, you can't do that anymore. These are all protected, and there will be no rescue excavation if one can help it from these sites. So this is knowledge from some decades ago, but that's the best we have. And what do we see when we just list up all these sites and look to common patterns in their in the bone remains that you find there? There are a number of characteristics that always reappear. So every castle site you excavate, you will see a number of things. One of them is hunted animals, like this red deer. And that's something typical. You will find them in castle sites in the Middle Ages, but you will never find them elsewhere. I'm just leaving towns outside of the picture for the moment, but we come back to that later. But when you go to an abbey or you go to a farm, you will never find the bones of hunted animals. And the reason is very simple. There was a privilege that was restricted to the feudal upper class for hunting these animals. So wild boar, roe deer, even hare, and this red deer could only be chased by the nobility, so by the upper class, the people who fought. The people who prayed in the abbeys were not allowed to hunt. it didn't match with their view of the world. Also, killing animals was something more problematic for them. But people who hunted were the people who lived in the early castles. But at the same time, one of the characteristics of all our sites is that the bones of hunted animals are always very rare. So one of the first cliches that people always think is medieval food is about eating hunted animals, is about eating wild boar, red deer, is not true. Even in the castle sites, this was a rare occasion that these animals were eaten. In terms of percentages, it's almost never more than 3 to 4% that we have hunted animals amongst our bone remains. And so all the rest is just the leftovers from domestic animals like pigs, cattle, sheep, and even goat. But still, rare as they are, they only appear in the castle sites as the result of a privilege. The same is true for the remains of these animals. This is the skull of a brown bear that was found in the castle that is now in the center of Bruges, completely overbuilt. But brown bear was hunted in medieval Flanders. The latest example we have of this animal is 12th century in the center of Brabant, close to Brussels. In the motte of Grimbergen did we find a 12th century remain of a part of a skull of a brown bear. But these animals are, of course, always very rare. They only appear in castle sites, but the strange thing is we have a little bit of brown bear in each castle site. So we have it in the castle of the counts in Ghent, in the castle at Ename, at Bruges, at Veurne. In all these sites you have 1 or 2 bones of brown bear. So the animal was hunted. It was a very dangerous hunt, and of course that hunt was a privilege again for the upper class. So this is also a symbol for this type of sites. And you see in hunting manuals from that period, indeed, that the hunt for the brown bear, you see the animal there laying in his nest, is a privilege. In this Spanish manual, it's even depicted as a privilege for the king himself. So you must be in the upper part of the upper class to be able to hunt these animals. So they are a symbol of prestige of your position within society. I often get the question whether these brown bears were not simply circus animals that were traveling around with gypsies and that were used in festivities at the castle sites. But you have to realize we are talking here Motte and Bailey castles from the 11th and 12th century, and that's at least a century before the rise of this kind of amusement. So the traveling groups that went from castle to castle, that's something typical for the Burgundian period, not for this early period. And I genuinely think that the brown bears that we found in the castle sites were hunted locally and were part of the wild fauna of Flanders. I also need to stress that all these animals were eaten. So they were hunted, but they ended up at the table because the skulls we find, even the thigh bones, so this part of your body, they all have these cut marks and they are chopped up. So it's really the brown bear has gone in the pots of the kitchen of the castle. So this is another privilege, but the same is true for a lot of other animals. There is also a hunting privilege in castle sites concentrated on large birds. And species like this crane or the heron or swans are typically found in castle sites, not in abbeys, not in other sites, because they could only be hunted by the lord of the castle. So everything that is big, that is, has a lot of color, is difficult to hunt, all these things are privileged and can be used as a symbol of the wealth of the owner of the castle. Because people knew ways of presenting these animals at the table in their plumage, so with all their colors and feathers still on, so that they impressed the guests. And the more prestigious foods you could offer, the more you show that you had large lands, that you were a good hunter, and so all this added to somebody's status. Surprisingly enough, in the castle sites, we always find in very small quantities, 1 or 2 bones again, pieces like this. What you here see is a vertebra from the tail of a sperm whale. So an enormous whale, and one of the bones has ended up in the castle in the center of Bruges. And that's something, again, typical, because we also find it in Ghent, in Eename, in Veurne, all these sites I already mentioned. You have always 1 or 2 remains from sea mammals. And they were also eaten because they have chop and cut marks. So whale meat was really a prized object in the medieval kitchen. The only thing we don't know for sure is whether these animals were really hunted at open sea or whether they were just drifted ashore. We know that there was a rule of law in, we know that from Burgundian times, where more of these texts have survived. There was a rule of law that every animal that's stranded ashore at the Flemish coast should go to the Count of Flanders. And so it could be that the stranding itself was organized under a privilege, and that these animals were then transported when they were still fresh, presumably, to the castle. But there are other texts indicating that people like the Count of Flanders had boats that they could use to go and hunt for sea mammals, for whales even, at open sea. But you can't tell from the bone, of course, whether it comes from an animal that has drifted ashore or was really hunted. But that's another example of the privileges, and it goes on, because there was also a privilege on large fish, like this sturgeon that was then still occurring in the river Scheldt. Now the animal is extinct in our waters, but when somebody per accident caught such a fish, it should go to the count. It was the privilege of the nobility. And so you see that everything that's colorful, large, and dangerous was used as a symbol for status. But having said this, this is really not the story of what people were eating every day in a medieval castle. These are the exceptions. These are the things that were used to impress family or guests, but that's not the daily food that people were preparing in a castle. And to talk about that, this is an old map. We have more sites now, but this is an old map with castle sites which have been studied and spread all over Belgium. And when you replace the location of these sites by the animal that was eaten most in all these castle sites, then the picture becomes this. So what people were eating in medieval castles is not hunted animals, is not the whale meat. What they were eating every day is pork. So pigs were the most important meat supplier for medieval castles. And there is one exception. In fact, there are 2. Meanwhile, the other one is not on the map yet. It's in the coastal area. So in Western Flanders, you have 2 castle sites where the most common animal was sheep and also a little bit of goat. And they differ from the inland. And when we look at these sites in detail, then you see here at the bottom of the slide 2 castles, Brugge and Veurne. And you see that indeed in yellow, sheep is the most common animal. On the top half of the slides are 2 rural sites, Zerkegem and Roxhem, farmhouses from the same period. And they have also a lot of sheep, but more cattle. But the main difference is here indicated in red. It's the difference in percentages of pork. So even in this coastal area, you see that castles were having more pork than rural sites, than farmhouses. The problem with the difference with the interior of the country is that in coastal Flanders, in that polder area of Western Flanders, you didn't have much forest. And pigs were, in those days, animals that you kept in the forest. And they were herded in the forest, and they could find their food really easily there. But in the coastal area, you don't have that kind of nature. And in that polder area, it's much more suitable to keep sheep a lot, but still there is a difference between castle and between rural sites. So even when sheep was the most common, the castles had more pork than the other part of society. In the interior, this doesn't play. The problems with the availability of the forest didn't play. And when you see, for instance, a Carolingian site in the very south of this country, Carolingian site at Wallin, the bones that have been studied there were 88% were pig bones. Thus, in those forested areas, people really concentrated on pig breeding. The thing you have to ask yourself, of course, now is, why did people do that? Why is it so that the feudal upper class distinguished itself from the other parts of society by eating a lot of pork? You could easily answer this question by simply stating, because pork is the best meat that you could buy or you could breed in those days. And indeed, there are indications that pig was seen as the gastronomic top product of those days, but that's not the only reason. It's not only about tastes or flavors within gastronomy. I think that there is much more behind this story of pork preference than meets the eye. So perhaps pig was a gastronomic top product, but I think it's only a gastronomic top product because people were eating it in the castles a lot. They liked what they chose to show other things than culinary preferences. There are indications that pig was also a real symbol of wealth and luxury. And the reason for that is that you can't use pigs for anything else than for their meat. You can breed cattle because you want the dairy products, milk and butter. You can breed sheep because you want the wool. And of course, at the end of the animals' lives, you all eat them. But when you keep pigs, then you are only going after the meat, because there is nothing useful except of meat production linked with pig breeding. And that's the reason why pigs are here depicted on this painting of Bruegel as a kind of a symbol of festivities, of luxury, the land of milk and honey, where everything is available in huge quantities. It's always symbolized by pigs and not by the other animals. So it gives a kind of a feeling of well-being when you are serving pork at the dinner table. But I think there is still even more behind this, because when we go to the period before the Middle Ages, the Roman period, then we see that pork, the meat of the pig, was then also already the preferred ingredient in the kitchen. What you see here is a funeral meal, and you see this, the head of a huge pig being served as the pièce de résistance of that meal. And we know that the Romans were really fond of pig. And we think that this is also the reason why medieval upper class was fond of pig, because when you study the mentality of the upper class during the Middle Ages, you realize that all they wanted to do is imitate the Romans. Everybody was dreaming of the great and lost Roman Empire. And when you see how, like this German emperor, Otto I, how he dressed, this is a Roman dress. We know from the whole entourage around Charlemagne that they all wanted to imitate the Romans, and members of his family even excavated Roman sarcophages and were buried in them. So they wanted really to have a close link with that lost great empire, and so they had a sort of a fascination for the Roman way of life. The only cooking books that in those early days that were surviving were copies from Roman texts, so they also got their ideas from there. And this is partly, we think, the reason why also the medieval upper class ate a lot of pork. Of course, this doesn't mean that they were slaughtering pigs every day. If you do a really detailed analysis of the wear of the teeth, then you can subdivide a pig population into some 50 age classes. And when you do that, then you see that there is a real rhythm in these distributions. And what this shows, and it goes from really young newborn animals here to the very, very old animals that have almost no teeth left because they are so completely worn. And what you see there is that you have slaughtering at certain moments during the animal's life. First, newborns, those are the piglets, the suckling pigs that were slaughtered when litters were too large or when you wanted a really prized ingredient for your meal. But then you see a first peak, and that we can calculate with the age of the animals that this is when pigs are born in May, and here they are some 8 months, and so these are going through their first winter. So what people did was slaughter a part of the population when they went into winter, because then that's the period of the year where the animals don't find food really easily, and so you have to give them extra food. And that costs a lot, so it's better to slaughter them and keep them salted or dried and keep the meat through the winter. But at this age, 8 months, medieval pigs are not fully grown yet. It's not like these fast-growing animals we have now. So a lot of them were kept alive and were slaughtered in the second winter. And then you get another peak, and that's slaughtering in the third winter. Oh, yeah. The third winter. So what you see is that even when people were eating a lot of pork, they were only eating fresh animals at certain parts of the year, when there was a big slaughter event at the beginning of the winter. And so most of the other forms of meat that they were eating must have been dried or must have been salted or even smoked. So it doesn't mean that the people at the castle got fresh meat every day. Something else to take into account is we have now looked for explanations for this preference for pork in more symbolic and cultural ways, but there is of course also a sheer economic reason why the people at the castle should eat pork, and that's they had the privilege of the use of uncultivated lands. Medieval law stated that the owner of the castle had the privileged use of all lands on his territory that were not under agriculture. So all the forests and the dunes and the swamps and things like that could be used by him. And when you have these large forests, the best thing you can do is of course not keeping cattle or sheep in them, but keeping pork. And so it could also be that this pure economic reasoning explains the pork preference in the castle. What you see is in sites like this, and this is the castle of Sugny that goes back to Carolingian times but survived into the 11th century. So you only see a part of the wall over there. It was located on this on the top of this rock. This castle was erected in the middle of the forest in an area where nobody lived, and was specifically meant to exploit that forest and to open up the land to do agriculture. And what you see in the first phase of this castle, you see that hunted animals for the whole of the site are pretty rare. But what you see in the oldest phase is that people are mostly eating pork over there, and beef and sheep, mutton, the meat of sheep, was rather infrequent. And when they open up the castle, the area, the landscape around the castle, then you see more and more cattle coming in, but pig stays again very important. So the castles were using the landscape as good as they could, but they still kept to that forest as a way of having an independent meat supply. There are still other things to be think about. You must not forget that pigs in medieval times, especially in those days around 1000 AD, they were still looking pretty much like wild boar. And so pigs were hairy, they were gray, and they were fierce animals. And it could well be that that link between the pig and the wild boar, its wild ancestor, meant that this wild boar, which has always been a symbol of fierce power within the hunting traditions of those days, that this symbolic value was transferred from the wild boar to the pig. So pig is closest to a wild animal that you can imagine. Sheep, the wild ancestors do not live in our countries, and aurochs, the wild ancestor of cattle, was already gone by that period. So the closest link to the wild nature is with pigs. And indeed, in hunting traditions, it is known that wild boar has always been a very problematic animal to go for. There is a saying in the Balkans that states when you go and you want to hunt a brown bear, it's better to take a doctor with you. But if you want to go and you want to hunt wild boar, it's better to take a priest. So it's a really dangerous animal, and especially in that symbolic world of medieval hunting, amulets like this one, this huge tusk of a male pig or a wild boar, is in itself a symbol of power. Somebody has worn it. It comes from a medieval grave found in Maastricht. But hunting the animal was something really dangerous to do, because when you do it right, what you have to do is you locate the wild boar, then you leave your horse alone, so you step down, and what you do is, problem with wild boar, I should say first, is that in contrast to other animals that you hunt, they don't run away. So red deer runs away, roe deer runs away, so that's really easy, you only have to chase them. But these animals turn back and they charge. And the thing to do was you step down from your horse, you take this spear, and you watch the animal approaching, and then you have to only one chance to do it right. You have to hit the animal with the spear just above the shoulder blade, so that it penetrates the heart and that the animal dies on the spot. When you don't do it right, the animal runs over you and mostly you die. So it's a really dangerous thing. It's a hunting tradition that also goes back to the Romans. Here you see this mosaic where they do the very same thing. And so this whole connotation between wild boar, pig, masculine behavior, showing off during hunting rituals, I think all these reasons are interwoven to explain why people were eating a lot of pork in medieval castles. But now back to reality, to a site as a case study. And this is a study we've done from a castle at Londerzeel, here in the center of Belgium. Here you see the donjon, so the main tower, excavated some years ago. And to be honest, when we started this excavations, the expectations were not too high, because what was left of the castle was only this one small tower, and the whole site didn't look too dramatic. And in fact, we were thinking at those days that we would excavate a minor castle, one of the smaller examples, nothing really spectacular to be expected. But then, when we started to sort out the bones that came from that castle, we saw that the castle had all these symbols that we had found in other castles, like the castles of the counts in Ghent and in Bruges. Large bird bones were found amongst the kitchen remains of the castle of Londerzeel. Of these species, even the silver egret, nowadays also nearly extinct in our country, the grey heron, the wild swan. But in terms of other animals, there was almost no remains of hunted species. No red deer, no wild boar. But what we did see were these animals, partridges and rabbits, and these have a special story. These animals have been introduced into castle sites. They were kept in confinement, they were kept in a sealed-off part of the territory, and they could breed there. The rabbit is even imported from Southern Europe for that reason, and the animals can very easily be kept together with partridges. And so these are substitutes for game. So in a part of the world where all the large game, like the brown bear, the red deer, wild boar, was already gone, people substituted and brought in these animals and they hunted them. Of course, not a hunt as fierce as the hunt for the wild boar, but it's still a privilege, and castle sites, and we will later see abbey sites, got these animals and other parts of society not. Going to everyday food, what did people eat at Londersale Castle? A lot of pork. A lot of pigs were eaten and slaughtered. Sheep is really rare. Cattle is only a third of the bone remains. And when we look to the pig bones more in detail, then you see here the distribution of the skeletal elements, and it goes from the skull to the feet. And you see that people were mostly eating the skulls, the heads of the pigs that they slaughtered. So this was the top food for the lord of the castle, that thing that we've also seen on that Roman funeral meal. So the pig's head as the pièce de résistance of the dinner. In sheep, this is completely different, for instance. There you have all parts of the skeleton more evenly spread. And so we realized while doing this faunal analysis of the castle of Londersale that there are indeed a lot of indicators for status. Even when we thought at the beginning that this would be a minor castle, there are elements that would suggested us that maybe the owners of Londersale Castle were also important members of feudal nobility of those days. And with better historical research, which is something we hadn't done at the beginning of the project, we realized that the family who stayed at Londersale got close links with the family of Vianden, nowadays in Luxembourg, and those were amongst the top of the feudal class of those days. And after the analysis of the building remains, we even found out that the castle of Londersale looks a lot like the castle that still survives nowadays at Corroy-le-Grand. And so it must have been something like this. And kind of an amateuristic reconstruction shows you that there is indeed a similarity. But then, so we've seen the castle sites, but the people who prayed were also no minor members of medieval society. They lived in abbeys. That's the key symbolic site for the clergy in medieval times. You also got the bishops in town, but we'll take the abbeys as our case study. And of course, people who were living here and who belonged to the top of the monks within the abbey also came out of noble families, so they had learned how to dine well, were then living in another surrounding, but we will see how they managed to organize their food. One of the important things for understanding abbeys is you have to realize that they got food rules. And the food rules come from the rule of Saint Benedict, who ordered the monks to live soberly and not spreading wealth, not showing too much luxury. And one of the things he wanted them to do is to avoid eating meat as much as possible. So there were a lot of days that they were really eating a vegetarian meal, and when they were eating meat, it was asked that they would always keep it very sober and rather minimalistic. So this acts upon all the abbey sites, and the main reason for Saint Benedict to say this is that meat, when you eat it a lot, then it's not only about food, but meat is also has a close link with sexuality. Within the medieval framework, with the medieval way of thinking, all things that were warm-blooded, like the meat of mammals, which are warm-blooded, makes people, when you eat it, makes people think about what they call the carnal pleasures, so with sexuality, and that is something you cannot have in an abbey. So that's one of the reasons to avoid the consumption of meat. And when we analyze the bones from abbey sites, and you see 4 contexts that have been sieved completely, because you have to sieve all that material in order to see the difference between the bones of mammals and the bones of fish, so the difference between meat and fish. And then you see in blue is the proportion indicated of fish in the diet, and in red you have the mammal bones. And this is compared, the 4 monastic contexts are compared with 2 civilian contexts, the Castle of Londersale, which we have seen, and a cesspit from Ghent, which was also sieved completely. And you see that indeed in the abbeys, people are eating more fish than in other parts of society, but at the same time we see that they didn't follow the rule completely. So there was, from time to time, the consumption of mammal meat. And of course there are rules that we know, that monks who were sick could have meat on certain occasions, and or maybe sometimes they just didn't follow the rules. But in any case, there is a clear difference between monastic sites and civilian sites. So a monastic, when you open up a cesspit, even you don't know where it comes from, you can immediately see that you're dealing with a monastic context when you have an enormous majority of fish bone. And when they were eating the meat of mammals, which is something which is very striking, is that when they did that, when they broke the rule, so to speak, they were eating the meat of cattle or the meat of sheep, and almost never, here in the percentages indicated in red, almost never the meat of pigs. And so when they broke the rule, they went to those 2 animals and not to pork. And one of the reasons, therefore, is, of course, that the pig is the most meaty animal you could have in medieval symbolism. You can't breed pigs except for their meat, and so the link between meat and carnal pleasures and pig is much closer than the meat with than the link with cattle and with sheep. And that's why in this painting of Jeroen Bosch, the pig is used as a symbol for sexuality, and even here it's depicted in a way that must have shocked people, because here the pig, as a symbol of sexuality, wears the dress of a medieval nun. So that's why they didn't go for pig. This doesn't mean all these rules of Saint Benedict did not hamper the development of a really luxurious and wealthy cuisine within monastic middens, because Saint Benedict didn't think about the creativity of medieval monks enough, because even when they were so restricted in what they could have in their kitchen, they organized it in that way that with the consumption of very large fish, like this large pike you see here, that they could still have a really gastronomic, well-organized kitchen, even when they couldn't eat meat. They even imported the carp from the Donau basin. This fish transferred to our part of the world, and it was bred in carp ponds, so especially dug ponds where they could breed those fish. And the reason why carp was introduced in our wild fauna is because monks didn't want this animal, because the taste is really valuable, and they grow fast, and you can easily keep them in captivity. Monks, after a while in the abbeys, also started to organize these compounds where they could breed certain animals. So you see the warrens, so these closed-off parts of the territory. You see them also appear on the territory of abbeys. And then we are again dealing with rabbits that were first imported in our part of the world because people wanted to use the fur, but of course they were then very soon were they consumed by humans. And the same is true for the pigeons that were imported to use their dung as a fertilizer in gardens, and that were soon after also a regular item on the table, also in abbeys. A case study shows you how rich an abbey kitchen could be. This is a 16th century case of the nunnery of Herkenrode, close by Hasselt. And it is known from historical sources that this was one of the most wealthiest abbeys, female abbeys in the Low Country. They got enormous territories, well-organized gardens, orchards, a huge territory of land that they could use, and all the nuns that were living at the Herkenrode Abbey indeed came from noble families. They got a really close link with the Bishop of Liège, and so people that were living there belonged to the really upper class of former society. These are the excavations, so most of the abbey is destroyed by the French Revolution. Part is still working, and this is now excavated, and we got a lot of consumption contexts that we could study. And what you see there is that these nuns, they were eating the meat of animals. They were eating cattle, and they were eating sheep. And when they were eating beef, so the meat of cattle, they were only eating meat from very young animals. So the best quality, they were eating the meat of calves and not of older cows. They were eating a lot of sheep. The Campine area is of course close, and that's easy to breed, to have large sheep herds over there. Pig is very rare at the site, so this matches with what we've said already. And when they were eating sheep, they were taking the best parts of the animal, so you have a really selective cut of the carcass that was used for the nuns of Herkenrode. They were eating a lot of poultry also, so domestic fowl is abundant in those amongst the bone remains, and we find the remains of chicken, goose and duck. That's rather normal. These animals have a long history with us. But in the 16th century, were these nuns already eating turkeys. And that's really special because turkey is a bird that is genuine to North America, North and Central America, that was only discovered by Columbus some 50 years before these contexts, and the nunnery of Herkenrode was among the first on the European continent to have turkeys in their gardens. And so presenting this animal at your table must have really impressed your guests, because you were one of the first Europeans to be able to serve this animal. They were eating a lot of fish, and only the good ones, only the big freshwater fish like this pike, eel, perch and carp. These are the best fishes you could find in fresh water, but they were also importing a lot of marine fish. Herring, that's normal, but cod and haddock are really big fishes that they transferred to the interior of Flanders, and that were consumed on a regular basis. Another sign of luxury is the consumption of these oysters. The flat oyster, which is the typical oyster for medieval times, now they have been replaced in the Low Countries almost exclusively by these imported oysters, but it is the real ones, and cesspits in the nunnery of Herkenrode are really full with it. So these nuns were really eating a wealthy cuisine. And to be honest, there is one class within medieval society that's left, and that's the common people, the ones who had to work. In fact, they had to do all the work, and to be honest, their sites are not well studied. The main problem we have in medieval archaeology in this country, and it's true everywhere, is that the sites, the habitation sites of poor people are not well studied, are not well known. Now slowly with the rescue excavations that we are more and more doing, this is changing, but for the moment I can't present you with a good overview of what common people were eating in those days. One of the problems is also that when you are poor, you don't consume too much and you don't have a lot of food remains. And when we are excavating rural sites, the main problem is that there aren't too many finds. And one of the other reasons is that you don't have good refuse contacts. There are no cesspits to be found, no deep ditches that have been filled with kitchen remains. So this stays a little bit out of the picture. So this is the model of the three orders within medieval society, and I think this helps to understand why, to explain the patterns that we are finding in the excavation of these sites. But there are, of course, sites that do not fit within that model. And one of the things I would love to do and to spend more time on is the study of, for instance, poor castles. There must be poor castles, like you had really rich castles. I thought we got a poor castle in Londersale, but now I don't believe it anymore. But there must be sites where people try to establish the behavior of the upper class, but couldn't, because they lacked money. Historical sources are really clear about it, that there were castles with severe financial problems, but I've never been able to lay my hands upon the food remains from those sites. And another group of sites that escapes is these moated sites, rich farmhouses in the polder area of Western Flanders, where the farmers became so rich that they could imitate castles. And they built a site on a raised platform with a really deep ditch around it. But I have never seen bone remains from such a site. So I don't know whether also in their food behavior they imitated castles or not. So I would love to see what people were eating there, but it will be waiting for a major development or large industrial exploitation to be able to excavate those sites. So the whole story of the upper class can be rounded up like this. And this is a kind of an overview I made with realizing that we don't find a lot of hunted animals in our sites. It's only a few %. We have to look for pork and other things to be able to identify a castle. But that was an overview I made a few years ago. And then quite recently, we excavated this site within a project of the development of huge industrial terrains at Aalter, just on the border of Western and Eastern Flanders. And what we were expecting there from prospection campaigns was a lot of prehistory, some Roman things, Metal Ages, occupation. A huge depression can be seen here that was used in the Neolithic. We expected a lot of things, but what we didn't expect was a medieval site. And still we found one at this location. And in retrospect, we should have known better, because when you have a farmhouse here with an orchard here, and you can expect that maybe there's an older habitation in the neighborhood. So this is the excavation plan. So all you see here is all prehistory, Metal Ages, Roman, a few Roman graves, a Roman road, and here you have circular ditches and a raised platform just in front of this farmhouse, and this is a medieval castle. We didn't know that the castle was there. We knew about the existence of a castle on the territory of this community, but nobody knew that it was located at that spot. On the surface, you could see nothing of that site. So that's a detail. And this is a really deep ditch. You have some remains of walls, but in fact, this is only what was left from the castle. And during the excavation, it looked like this. So we opened up the whole field in a strip and map exercise, and then this deep ditch became visual. So this is the only thing that's left of the castle. So we didn't expect too much. This is every brick that we could draw. It was drawn, there weren't too many. But when you then go to the site, we could reconstruct the surface of the ditch. From the walls that were visible, we could erect a part of this building, and then making it a complete castle. It must have looked something like this. And in fact, now we think that it looked like this. This is the Muiderslot in the Netherlands. And so there must have been such an impressive castle at the Alter site. We now know that it was the castle of the lords of de Woestijnen. Woestijnen, it's derived from the medieval word wastine, and that means uncultivated land. So this castle must have been there. And then we started to sort out the bones, and surprisingly, there were hundreds, really hundreds of bones of red deer. So there goes my theory that red deer is always very rare in medieval castle sites. Here we got them by hundreds. And in terms of percentage, of course, we got a lot of bone. In terms of percentage, it's still not that much. It's 5% of the whole collection. Most of what we had found is cattle, so indicated in blue, but the green part above on this slide is the frequency of red deer bones. So a lot of red deer, and this was really surprising because until then I was teaching my students that red deer was nearly extinct in Flanders, going towards the end of the Middle Ages. So we only regularly found 1 or 2 bones per site, and that made us think that the animal must have been overhunted in the 14th, 15th century. And in this 15th century castle then, it pops up again in large quantities. And so that's really strange because we know that deforestation was already really severe at that period of time. So the animals didn't have any forest left to live in, but maybe they had adapted to more open landscapes, and they could live in a large enough herd around the castle of Woestijnen to be shot and to deliver such a number of bones. But there was something else that was strange in the bones. And here you have again from cranium, that's the skull, to the phalanges that are the fingers and the toes of the animal. Then you see with these hundreds of bones that you have a really uneven distribution of skeletal elements. One of the things that's striking is that you don't have any skull bones. And you also have almost no shoulder blades, the scapula above. You don't have any pelvis, that's the thigh bones here. These are completely lacking, while the other bones are rather frequent. So it's like only certain parts of the animals were used in the kitchen of the castle and others were not. And that's something, when you start to think about it, that has also been found in a number of castle sites in England, research by Naomi Sykes from Nottingham University, and she was able to link this pattern with what you can read in hunting books. Because the good thing of late medieval hunting culture is that they have written down the rules of how a proper hunt should be organized. And of course it's difficult to read. This is a 14th century example. But the title of this chapter in the hunting book, it's the Book of St. Albans, says, "How you shall break a hart." And a hart is a male red deer, so the male animal. And to break an animal in medieval English means how you split up the carcass after you have shot the animal. So there are certain rules, and they were followed in most of the English castles. They are found in some French sites, but they had never been found in the Low Countries until the excavation at Alter, simply for the reason that we almost never have red deer. But now we see that the splitting up of the carcasses of the red deer that were hunted at Alter really meticulously follows these hunting rules. And these hunting rules are known as the Norman hunting tradition. It's the origin of the practices that are described in those books are not known, but they were spread. They started to be spread in England when the Normans invaded England in the 11th century, and they have then spread over Europe and became a real tradition when people were hunting. And the rules say that when you kill an animal, a male red deer, what you don't take with you to the castle is the skull and the vertebra. This is slaughter offal. These are heavy bones, and there is not much meat attached to it, so you leave them. And more specifically, the thigh bone that you see here, the pelvis, is always left at the spot. You never take it with you, and it's given to the ravens, they say, to the wild birds. So they even call, in medieval English, they call the thigh bone the raven bone. And what you then do is you split up the animal, and you give the upper part of the front limbs, one of the two you give to the best hunter, so the animal, the person who has killed the animal can have his own prize, and that's the upper part of one of the front limbs. And the best keeper of your hunting territory, so the guy who is responsible for the animals to thrive well on your ground, he gets the upper part of the other limb. So those parts never arrive at the castle site, according to the Norman hunting traditions. And indeed, it is true, we don't have them in Aalter, because the pelvis is missing, it's left at the side, and we have the scapula and humerus, that's the upper bone from the forelimb. They are really rare, and cranium, mandibula are completely absent. So that's the upper skull and the lower jaw. But there is something else. The hunting traditions, the Norman hunting traditions, they say that it is forbidden, or it is not noble, to hunt an animal that doesn't have a head of 10, they call it. And a head of 10, that means that it needs to have 10 points, 5 on each side, or more on its antlers. And what you see here at the left is an animal with a head of 8. So you should never hunt this. And this animal has a head of, I think, 12, and that's a good animal to hunt. So the hunting laws say you only hunt male animals, of course, because the females don't have any antlers, and you need a head of 10. Otherwise, it is not something noble to do. You can't present an animal like the left one here on your dinner table. And when we then look to the bones of Aalter, what you have to know is that it takes some time for the animals to develop a head of 10. In the beginning, the very young males have only 2 points, and then it slowly develops, and during the first half of the year, the antler they develop each year, it grows back from nothing, from the skull, always gets more points. And we know that you need at least an animal of 4 years or more to have a head of 10. And when we then look at the material from Aalter, and we look to the fusion of the long bones, that's a technique we use to see where the articulating surfaces of a long bone are fused with the shaft of the long bone. That's something that happens at certain moments in life. And when it's fused, you have an older animal, and when it's non-fused, you have a younger animal. And what we see in Aalter is that indeed all of the red deer that were eaten at the castle, most of them are old animals. So that's an indication that they must have been going for an animal with a head of 10. And when we look at measurements on the phalanges, so the bones from the hand and the foot of the animal, and we compare them with recent reference material, then you see here measurements for females in circles and measurements for males with crosses. And then the dark triangles are the bones from Aalter, and indeed we think they are all male. So they are old animals, all male, So the hunt was really done according to the Norman traditions. And that gives us an image of what people were doing at that castle site. And reading back in the hunting books, we can reconstruct the story like this. So it all starts with people who have to locate the red deer that will be shot. So what you do is you take such a dog, a bloodhound, a limer it's called in the medieval terminology, and this animal is trained to smell the droppings, so the excrements of the red deer. The hunter, or the man who prepares the hunt, looks for hair of the animal that he finds. He looks for tracks, and what they were trying to do at this stage of the hunt is to identify the age and, of course, also the sex of the animal from the droppings and the tracks. How deep they went into the mud, how big the droppings were. Big droppings mostly come from big animals. How high the hair was found on the branches of trees. There were all sorts of ways, and people could, from doing these prospection rounds, could predict the size of the animals they were going for. So smaller, younger animals were left alone, but when the limer got the scent and the track of a large male red deer, then the dog could remember this, and the next day they organized a hunt. And what they then did is, first, really early in the morning, you got a large picnic, where the Lord, depicted above, was shown the droppings, you see that here, of the animals. And so the Lord inspected it, and he had to give his permission to start the hunt. And you see here the bloodhounds that are ready, and then they followed the specific track of that one large animal that they had chosen the day before. They always went for one animal, the largest male red deer they could find. And all these pictures are, by the way, from the hunting book of Gaston de Phoebus. You can find them on the internet. And this is the hunt itself. So they chase the male red deer, and they do that for almost a complete day, because it took a long time until the animal became so tired of the hunt, and at the end stood still, and then they could kill it. So it was a real sport activity. And when they do that, then it is the most important member of the hunting party who could break the beast, who could split up the carcass. In French they call it le curé. Part of it was given to the hounds. The intestines were given to the hounds. The thigh bone was left for the ravens. Important people got their part of the forelimbs, and the person here, depicted a little bit larger than the other ones, is the one who is splitting up the carcass. And this was done in a really ritualized way. You always started at the same point. You worked from head to back, and people got special knives to do this. And the art of the whole ritual was to split up the carcass without leaving any traces on the bones, and even more important, to do it without rolling up your sleeves of your dress. So you see that his sleeves are down, and not spilling one drop of blood onto your clothing. So it was a whole showing off, a whole prestigious thing to do, and that is then translated in that very specific composition of the bone remains. Here you see another depiction where the Lord is given one of the feet of the red deer. The dogs are allowed to bite the fur for a very limited time period. Yet another one, and here the dogs are fed with a mixture of bread and blood from the animals. So a very ritualized way of doing that we are now locating here in this, on the map of Mercator, you see the site of Woestijn, but here you see a church tower and no castle. But we know that in this site, in this surrounding, even without a lot of forest, there was a large herd of red deer and people were organizing this hunt. Going more into detail into the historical sources about the ownership of the castle, it was not well studied. We knew from the medieval sources that there was a family called the Lords of de Woestijnen. So the Woestijnen was this area you see here. And now we found out that indeed this family derives from one of the last counts of Flanders, but not in the normal way. It was one of the bastard sons of the count that was given that property and who developed that castle there. And some steps, some generations down this family lineage, we end up in the period that the bone remains of Alter Woestijnen Castle were deposited, and then the castle is occupied by Louis of Flanders, and he was a very important member of the whole court of Emperor Charles, and he was an ambassador even in England, so a really wealthy person that must have organized hunting parties at that castle. In fact, one of the striking things is that except for the red deer, there is nothing noble to be seen in the whole of the castle. So we think that they only used it as a hunting lodge and that all the other symbols of prestige were kept away for their townhouses. And so it's only the red deer that gives the story of nobility away. So this was our model. To end up, I just want to explain you that this was no model for eternity. So the medieval way of structuring society as a divine creation didn't last. And one of the reasons for that is the rise of towns. In that medieval landscape, towns became more and more important, and this heralded the end of the three orders. And one of the reasons is that people in towns became independent from the other classes, they became rich, and also they organized their food supply themselves for a large measure. And one of the things they did is starting to breed pigs in towns. Here you see a picture from a Christian village in Syria, where you see the pigs in a closed area because the Muslim people around shouldn't see them. And these animals are really doing well, and it shows that you can breed pigs on a really small surface, giving them food refuse, and so then you have an independent meat supply. But also towns organized their own markets, and the rise of urban markets started the import of marine fish into Flanders. That's a completely different story, but it made them independent, and so they escaped the structure of the three orders within society. And so you got the growth of a new elite, a new upper class that was composed by merchants, artisans, bankers, politicians even, and these people became even richer than the feudal lords, and they could start a competition to be the most important within former society. In fact, at some point with the rise of towns, you got four orders, and that it's not only the nobility, the clergy, and the civilians. So the clergy and the people, but also the civilians in towns became, in fact, a sort of a fourth order, and that changed the structure of society completely. And we will see later in Parliament, in the first parliaments, like in England, you see that there are three orders that are represented, but it's no longer the three medieval ones. It's the clergy, the nobility, and the civilians that get into parliament. They get democratic rights, but the people are, of course, still left out. But this contemporary drawing summarizes what was happening. It was the money devil, the fact that people in towns could become so rich, that altered the whole divine structure of society. And it's that money devil that is here severely attacked by the nobility and by the clergy, because of course they didn't want to lose their place, but eventually they had to give in. Another problem in those days of late medieval Flanders and the Low Countries in general, is that we have ecological problems within that society because almost all of the forest is gone. And that means that all the means for breeding pigs are also gone for the nobility, and that they have to change their whole way of organizing their meat supply. The little forest that was still left was also a forest that was no longer suited for pig breeding. What people did was, in this oak forest, like you see here, there are really few large trees, and most of the trees are younger than 15 years. And those are bad trees to produce acorns, and the acorns are needed as food for the pigs. So the habit of cutting the wood for firewood and other reasons every 15 years made these forests impossible to live in for the pig herds. And this is what happened every 15 years with such a forest. And this is, of course, no breeding place for medieval pigs. And eventually, this caused the downfall of the pig. And from the most highly priced culinary product in the late medieval kitchen, pig is nowadays regarded as a meat product lower than, for instance, beef. When we think about having a nice piece of meat on our plate, then we think about a steak cattle. But pig is now has become a kind of a second-rate meat product. And you see that really exemplified in products like this, where you have this spiced ham that's really popular in Anglo-American cuisine, and that for sanitary reasons is now also produced in a light version. So, but this is the terrible end of what happened with the pig from medieval times going to now. And to summarize it all up, what has happened is that the whole structure of society in 3 orders is now changed in a completely different society, composed of rich people, not that rich people, people that are not rich at all, and the really poor. So this was my story, just as a kind of an illustration how you can organize your thinking about former dietary patterns. Thank you for your attention.